Good evening. Good evening. Welcome to another Arriscraft Metrolinx lecture tonight. As you know, we've been looking really at transportation infrastructure for the past weeks, and tonight we're going to look at transportation infrastructure at its most basic, but also I would say its most important level, certainly when you're negotiating sidewalks in these days, and that is the life and the fate of the pedestrians, especially in Toronto. So we have two speakers tonight who came from Toronto. First of all, Jane Farrow. She is well known as a CBC personality, I would say, or Radio 1 personality, a couple of shows, and very famous worldwide for her Jane's Walks that she started in 2007, not named after her, but after Jane Jacobs. And I have a very personal relationship to Jane's Walks because in 2008 I was married to Miriam Greenbaum on the eve before a Jane Walk, and the next morning the two of us had to actually do one of them. It was kind of a funny Jane's Walk because it was in Kensington Market, and it was on Saturday, so it was on Shabbat. And Miriam told me that she was going to guide the tour through Kensington Market to show people what Kensington Market was like. In the spirit of Jane Jacobs, you're really looking at all the details of the way the life operates in a neighborhood. And she said, you better take the rear guard. You are at the back of the troop to ensure that everyone makes it through Kensington Market. And the reason, of course, is that there are two shuls there, two synagogues, both of them who normally do not have enough worshippers. And indeed, when we passed the Minsker shul, what happened was that a rabbi came to our tour and basically goes to people and said, are you Jewish, are you Jewish, are you Jewish? And we lost 4 people to the shul. We needed to have 4 Jewish men to be able to do the prayer. So I ended up in the shul to basically take care of them, and Miriam had said we're going in that direction. So half an hour later we caught up with them. So Jane Jacobs' walk, Jane's Walk is not without risks. Any case, that is Jane Farrow. Right now, I think in 75 cities, 15 countries, Jane's Walk. Yeah. So this is really an amazing Canadian export product. I don't think that Prime Minister Harper yet has sold it to the Chinese, but he's selling everything else of our country, so maybe he will do this too. And figured out how to monetize it. Yeah, of course, that is the problem. But you know, at least in the Minsker shuls, they knew how to monetize it in spiritual currency for heaven. And then we have Paul Hess, who's a professor of planning at the University of Toronto. He's head of the graduate program of planning. And he is very much involved in thinking about the life and the future of pedestrians in Toronto, especially in the inner suburbs. And today, Paul and Jane will present their work on this. What we're going to do is, you do your presentation. I understand that it will be an alternating presentation. Then we will have a few rounds of questions afterwards. So let's welcome Jane and Paul here in Cambridge tonight.
This comes from some work that we did about 4 years ago now, and I actually had gotten a grant. Most of my work had been about looking at the conditions that make environments more walking, and I had this grant where I actually wanted to go talk to people who live and walk in environments which are kind of unwalkable and try to understand their lives. And Jane had wrote me into Jane's Walk, so I went to her and I said, look, I'm trying to do this. Can you figure out how to do this, or who I should get to help me do this? And she's like, oh, that's fantastic. I want to do it. So we collaborated very much on this project, and I certainly learned a lot working with her, and I think it was a really great collaboration. So tonight we're going to talk about that work. I'm going to sort of introduce the talk and explain the title first of all. It's not all cafe lattes. And then Jane's going to sort of present the guts of the research, the experiences we had talking to the people, and a lot of photographs that really illustrate what these conditions are about. And then I'm going to come back and actually talk about why those environments are that way and how the kinds of conditions you find in those environments are really structured into them, into the property relationships in those environments, and into how we planned and designed them. So these are very much environments that we purposely created. And then we'll come back at the end, and Jane will come back too, and we'll kind of talk about, well, what do we do about them? What do we do with these places? So let me just set up my slides here just for a second. So I have my notes. Oops. So this talk is really about the idea of walkability, and a lot of the research has been on the notion of walkability, which is a qualitative and quantitative measurement of how inviting or uninviting an area is to pedestrians. When I started doing work on pedestrian environments in the early 1990s, actually, I'd never heard that word, walkability. In fact, I only started hearing it about 10 years ago. The little graph on the right here is actually from a publication citation source where I just put in the keyword walkability. And you can see really before 2000, there were no articles that used that term. And now there are literally thousands of articles. And that's because creating good places for people to walk is now very much recognized as crucially important for livable, healthy cities. There are literally thousands of research studies, what I call by the public health planning research complex, that look at the connections between walkable environments using these kinds of metrics that are mentioned there, those kinds of variables, and trying to understand what makes walkable environments. So the diagrams on the left there, those are actually from Seattle, where I used to do my research, and they just show the walkable area if you start in the middle of those areas where the red star is, and how far can you get by walking a mile on the network. And so that's an old kind of streetcar neighborhood in Seattle versus a kind of post-war auto-oriented neighborhood, and it really gives you the sense of how differently these places are planned. So the idea of walkability has really become mainstream so much so now that it's part of real estate listings. So in the upper left there, that's actually from Cambridge, just across the river. It's a real estate listing that I just looked up a few days ago. I don't know if people know what that building is. But on the bottom there, you can see in the blue, it has a walk score. And all the real estate listings now have walk scores. That building has a walk score of 90 out of 100. So supposedly it's a very good place to go walking. There's also been lots of discussion about the idea of peak car, that car use is no longer growing, that young people care more about having cell phones than having cars, and that the way that we live in cities is very much changing. Ideas of re-centralization, with lots of people, downtowns experiencing resurgent growth in condominiums and housing especially, but also sometimes in jobs. That's kind of illustrated by that nice picture of Toronto in the fog with all the cranes. And ideas about retrofitting the suburbs and making them good places to walk. I like this picture here that comes from work by Ellen Durham Jones and June Williamson on retrofitting the suburbs, bringing Bing to the burbs, so to make them good places to walk. Oops. I can't see on the screen, so I have to kind of guess where it is. So all in all, I think this is a good news story with cities remaking themselves to better accommodate pedestrians and bicycles. New York City is clearly one of the most celebrated cases of this. About 10 years ago, I think no one would have imagined that New York City would start closing off streets to cars. I knew a Danish researcher that had this great idea that New York was a great place for cycling, and he was peddling it around New York, and people thought he was absolutely nuts. In the last 10 years, New York is actually remaking its streets for cycles and pedestrians. There are new guidelines out about modifying streets to make them better places. NACTO, the National Association of City Transportation Officials Urban Street Design Guideline. NACTO didn't even exist a few years ago. Typically, engineering guidelines for roadways comes from designing highways. Originally had sort of rural highway origins, and having special guidelines actually to modify urban streets and make them good places for walking and pedestrians and socializing is a brand new kind of thing. And even in Toronto, with Rob Ford's War on the Car, there's movement in this direction. So that's kind of how powerful it is, even with a kind of very politicized environment in Toronto. You have lots of changes going on to streets and making them into more sociable, better places to walk. On the upper left there is Gould Street near Ryerson University, which has been pedestrianized. They've recently been in the news because the $170,000 paint job they put on that street is peeling up. There have been the parklets, which was an experiment on Church Street last summer. It used ideas that were being used in US cities like San Francisco to extend the curbs and make them social spaces. Jane was actually involved in that initiative on Church Street. And Sherbourne Street in Toronto now actually has a separated bicycle lane on it, and it's one of several that are in the works. So these kinds of modifications are going on even in places where there's a kind of backlash against these ideas. These projects are moving ahead. The problem with much of this positive movement for reshaping cities is that they are directed to support really the new urban elite that's living in downtown cores. That's definitely the focus, even unconsciously, and you find that in like the pronunciations of Richard Florida and his research associating walkability with economic growth. So the creative class, which is really a group of gentrifying people, are remaking the centers of large successful metropolitan areas like New York and San Francisco and Toronto. And as a result, these kinds of cities are catering kind of towards these new urban lifestyles, this new generation of gentrifiers. So that's why we kind of facetiously call it latte urbanism. This is kind of remaking cities so that you have this kind of cafe lifestyle where you can sit out in cafes and in your leisure time talk to your friend and drink lattes. Now, don't get me wrong, I like good coffee very much. I don't particularly like lattes, but I like good coffees. I like cafes. I partly got into this business because big cities and their street life really energized me. I arranged my whole lifestyle so I could walk to work, and I wouldn't need a car. I have a car, but I don't actually need one. So I really appreciate these kinds of places. And these are photographs from places in my neighborhood in Toronto, including Kensington Market on the upper right there. I actually Googled the words walkability and latte together and looked at Google Images, and that's one of the images that came up. The issue is that these images have very little to no relevance for the kind of conversation we need to have around walkability, especially in places like the inner suburbs. We're going to talk about Toronto, but there are actually lots of places that are just like this because they were kind of created as part of the post-war planning system. So the conversation for those places and the people that live there need to be different than creating cafes and street life. To Richard Florida's credit, in the quotes that I just showed you, he refers to people wanting to live in walkable neighborhoods if they could. So he has that word, if they could, in there, and that's exactly the problem, really, as suggested here from David Hilchansky's work on income polarization in Toronto. There are many, many people who can't afford to live in walkable suburbs. So I'm sure many of you have seen this map before, but the red areas are basically places that are below the median income for the city. They're quite impoverished places for many of their residents, and they're mostly in the areas of the city that were planned and developed in the post-war period. It's only in the very center, in that area there, that you get the pre-war neighborhoods, which are highly walkable. So I'm going to pass the talk to Jane in just a second, who's going to present the work that we did, talking to residents that live in those less walkable places that are not populated by the creative class. Richard Florida's group actually put out a creative class map that looks very much like this one, actually, with the creative class kind of living on the subway lines in the downtown, and the non-creative class, whoever those are, living in less accessible places. And they're living there not because they don't like walkability, but that's where they can afford housing. I mean, it's very simple. Housing is also cheap where it's not very accessible to the center. It's far from the subway. The conditions suck. You can't walk very well. People who choose to live in walkable neighborhoods, but a lot of people don't have that choice. So after Jane does her piece, I'm going to come back and talk about how these conditions are structured into these places and the different kind of conversation we need to start having to make them better places. A conversation that doesn't involve images of cafes, Manhattan parks or streets, or European public spaces and streets, which are shown on the top photos here. I'm not going to mention the organization that did this because I think they do good work and I generally respect them. But those photographs actually came out of a publication that resulted from workshops done with residents living in these neighborhoods in the bottom slides, Flemington Park and Thorncliffe Park in Toronto, which are inner suburban neighborhoods, almost all high-rise apartments, almost entirely low-income immigrants living in them who are just not going to have the opportunity to be drinking wine on the Seine River or wherever that is in their neighborhood anytime in the near future. So when you work with these people and then you populate your publication with these kind of images of Copenhagen and picnicking on the Seine, I actually don't think it gets very far in actually improving the lives of a lot of the people that are living in our cities. So instead of looking like those places, a lot of the inner city neighborhoods look more like this on the next slide. Jane.
Thank you, Paul. And so what we wanted to do, and I felt extremely fortunate in meeting Paul and roping him into Jane's walk, but I knew he was the big guy in Toronto to talk about walkability, so I had to engineer in a very cagey way how to rope him in. He's a busy guy. And I knew that we would share the analysis that in spite of the perception that the suburbs is where everyone has a car, he knew and I knew from being out there that in fact there was tons of people walking. It just wasn't in the discourse. And a lot of the reason, like people around my friends, the urbanistas downtown, would slander people that lived in the suburbs because they're all car drivers. But I knew they weren't all car drivers. There's a lot of kind of low, it was very derogatory. There's a bunch of this stuff was based on car drivers, walkers are better and stuff. So there was a lot of already division between the suburbs and the core in Toronto. It was producing political divisions and cleavages that we're still living through. And I sensed that there was a great room to improve the mutual understanding of who was living there, how they got around, and what it was like. So I was very lucky to be able to work with Paul. Not being trained as a planner or architect or anything of that sort, I was thrilled to sort of like be a sous chef in the kitchen of Paul Hess, who really is the protein in the sandwich of these walkability studies. So they were funded by SHRC and the Toronto Community Foundation, and they were the first of their kind done in North America. We've never heard of anything like them being done. And they were done in 8 neighborhoods. Is this where no, we're not working off this one? On the keyboard here? This one? Yeah, okay. 8 neighborhoods: Chalk Farm, Kingston Galloway, Scarborough Village, North Kipling, The Peanuts, Steeles Lamoureux, Thorncliffe Park, and for contrast we did one high-rise neighborhood, downtown Toronto, which was close to transit, St. Jamestown. Anyone grow up in a high-rise neighborhood? Anyone grow up in a suburb? Well, all right, okay. So as you probably know, inner suburban high-rises are home to hundreds of thousands of Toronto residents, including many newcomers, a lot of youth, a lot of seniors, and these people rely heavily on transit and walking. They're high-density environments surrounded by wide arterial streets, cul-de-sacs and fencing. I'm sure you know the urban form. And they're generally considered very poor walking environments, but of course there's lots of pedestrians in them. Our studies sought to highlight the importance of these places with the goal of helping to improve them. We worked with residents to audit the walking environment, to map their walking routes, to note where the missing connections were, the obstacles, the hazards they encountered, and identify opportunities for making things better. So we have passed along our studies to the authorities and people in Toronto, in the city, to help make those improvements and work with the community. But and one hope from doing the study was that it would even raise the idea of urban literacy, that people would know a bit more about walkability. And generally, as you may know, very few people cleave to the identity of pedestrian. You know, people are much more likely to identify as a cyclist. Pedestrian even sounds horrible, right? It's pedestrian. It's pretty low on the totem pole. But in order to get things improved in the walkability environment, in the walking environments, it would be helpful to make people aware that they are indeed pedestrians in the first place, and that that's okay. So our findings. Number one, few residents have cars and depend on walking and transit to perform their daily activities. People in high-rise neighborhoods are surrounded by car infrastructure, but very few have vehicles. But of course, most people assume that if you're in the suburbs, you own a car. So this is definitely wrong, according to our research. In fact, the numbers are very interesting. 56% of our study participants had no driver's license, 42% of households had no car, and 67% of single-parent households had no car. So these are very unusual numbers. Like, they surprised us. They're quite the finding, and no one else has come up with these numbers. And often, as you may know, if you're familiar with how they study transportation, they may do some census data. They may try to get an estimate on the modal split. They often only use phone books. They call people with landlines. They only call people who own houses, not renters. And of course, that's going to eliminate everyone in a high-rise right now, who are renters on cell phones and may not even speak English, which would make it very hard to, participate in a survey. So the people who are walking tend to be excluded from the numbers in many ways. So the high-rise residents we studied got most of their grocery shopping and errands done on foot. We also discovered that women have less access to cars than men, and they often mix modes when they are taking a trip, mixing transit, on their way to the store, and then a taxi home when they have lots of bags to come back with. So, finding number two. Despite the fact that most of our high-rise neighborhood study participants do not have cars, they live in neighborhoods that are built for the car. And they're frequently living in what amounts to towers, not in the park, but towers in the parking lot, surrounded by multi-lane arterials. And as you can see, there's these amazingly innovative and just a very determined effort to get around the obstacles in the neighborhood. Like, I love this desire line that pretty much is a high jump event. But it seems like where there's a will, there's a walk. They won't be stopped. They'll put up with some pretty bad conditions, but gee whiz, wouldn't it be great if they just took the fence down, make it possible. Like here, this is in Scarborough Village, putting up with some pretty shabby conditions. Amenities like grocery stores and schools, they're sometimes nearby, but fences and unsafe paths and parking lots surround them. They have to take long, indirect routes, which often involve muddy, slippery, unpleasant walkways, bad lighting, partial hidden views. Raise your hand if any of this is familiar from living in the suburbs. Has anyone encountered these kinds of, kids actually, when you're growing up, you see a lot of this, getting to and from schools, and usually make some pretty inventive shortcuts. Here's some delightful biking infrastructure in Thorncliffe Park. It's actually a walkway that serves pedestrians and cyclists, so not exactly where you want to ride your bike. So in fact, it's not really biking infrastructure. There's very little, if any at all, in the suburbs. And of course, this drives cyclists often to ride on sidewalks, which brings them into conflict with pedestrians, which is another safety hazard and risk. It's interesting, you can look around and see that there were originally some thoughts given to walkable neighborhoods and connections. I mean, the stairway on the left is kind of the road to nowhere, but was originally a path that would have cut across. One building beside it would have used their side lot to get to the arterial, but over the years they put fences up, and you know, it cuts it off and makes it worse for people. So oddly, sometimes they thought about that originally, but they went backwards on it. Okay, finding number 3. Yes, so they might be doing a lot of walking, but people don't necessarily want to be walking. So you could say, in fact, that in some ways the residents of the inner suburban high-risers are the greenest of Torontonians. They generally walk more, they take transit more often, they don't own cars, and due to income levels, they tend to consume less. And by anyone's definition, that means they're pretty green. That said, they're not really green by choice. They would love to get a car. And who wouldn't if this is what you're putting up with? It's understandable, but you know, it's unfortunate they're not honored in essence by their great practices by infrastructure that kind of honors how they move around. In fact, this is usually what they look at. And you know what? They don't want to walk 192 meters. And back. This, which gets us to another problem, which is they will run across an arterial and risk life and limb in doing that. So they have a hard time getting around their neighborhoods, and it's not fair, even though they do it in big numbers. So 4, we found a very interesting tendency that people summarized or felt about their walking environments quite differently. Most importantly, when we went out and asked people, what do you think of your walking environment? Everyone in every one of these neighborhoods. And if you don't know the neighborhoods, some of them, if you saw that list, many Torontonians would feel that these are very dangerous neighborhoods where there's high conflict, gang activity. They would be afraid to go there. So many Torontonians would perceive these neighborhoods as unsafe or undesirable and not nice places to walk. Now, you ask the people who live there, practically uniformly, people say they really like it. They like walking in the neighborhood, and there are challenges and obstacles, but they really don't want to dump on their neighborhood. Now, that said, they will say that they like to go for walks, but they encounter obstacles. And they like connecting with their neighborhood. They see the value of walking. They want places to sit. They want places to hang out. They want the walking environment to be better, but they refuse to sort of throw their neighborhood under the bus and evaluate. So this is, you know, what walk score would capture perhaps is the distance to a good cappuccino. But that doesn't actually measure how people feel about it and what socially goes on in that environment, which people do actually connect. They might have to negotiate 8 lanes of traffic to get to the convenience store, but they are actually experiencing very important social connectivity in that environment as well. In fact, many newcomers say that they have come from places that they were very walkable, so there's a great appreciation and tradition for walkability and the importance of walking, and they know that it's not just about getting from A to B, but they do face some pretty serious threats. People also spoke of isolation in the winter. I think that's very real to people this year, regardless of where you live. Sometimes when it just gets that cold and there's that much snow, it's pretty uninviting to go out. Snow, ice, slush, pooling water, a source of dread, frustration, and even fear for people. And another interesting thing was how youths perceived the walking environment. Now, in general, parents were the most fearful group. When they spoke of their children, they were very afraid of letting their children walk around, and that tends to be about a fear of the children's getting hit by cars. They were only 24% of them said that they were comfortable with their children walking to school alone. But interestingly, youth were the most anxious about the pedestrian environment. They reported being fearful of adults, actually, and other youth, security, police, especially around stores and malls, parks and quiet streets. And so the people that some would say they were the most afraid of in the walking environment reported higher levels of fear and anxiety about walking, the highest of anyone in the study, which is actually fascinating. They had some very clever workarounds for this. The youth will tend to stay on heavily trafficked arterials. They like to be in the view of other people. They feel safer there. They feel that it's much riskier to walk alone in cul-de-sacs and smaller streets. So they're negotiating it, but it's quite an interesting insight on how they experience a walking environment. Okay, walking conditions vary. All high-rise neighborhoods we have studied have shortcomings typical of an urban environment built for cars. That would include fast...
Wait, we have to go back.
This one?
We have time. We have time to tell our
that's
Rockport
right.
anecdote. So Jane and I were actually, we had an exhibition at Urban Space Gallery in Toronto of some of this material. And we invited both Kathleen Wynne, when she was transportation minister, and Rob Ford, who came with some of his big guys that he brings around the place.
I don't believe Alessandro Lisi was there that night. But
it was a very awkward meeting between Wynne and Rob, even then, before his troubles. And he saw this photograph, and he said, I know where that is. I've tried to get that gate unlocked many times.
Yeah.
And it was only after the whole crack video stuff came out.
This is up in Dixon Road.
Night, and I realized this is Dixon Road Apartments where he allegedly buys his crack. So now we are. At the time, Kate was very impressed. He said, see, he really knows his neighborhood.
He gets it. He gets it.
Now we know why.
He's on our side. He's trying to unlock that door. Yeah. Yeah, and maybe he made the hole in the fence, too. It's excellent. Yeah. See, this is, I love these pictures. I mean, it was Paul that showed me, like, that it's not just a hole in the fence. This is an incredible act of will for people, right? The fences will not hold people back. We have some other shots coming, but I hope some of this stuff is looking familiar to people. Like the bent down fences, the determination that people have.
Sorry, I threw you off.
No, that's good. They liked it. You see, they really liked that Rob stuff. I have a picture. That night because I was this Jane's Walk person, and it was Kathleen Wynne, it was Rob Ford, and then me. And I'd like to refer to that as the lesbian sandwich he never really wanted to think about. It's not the one he thought of in his dreams. There, that's even cruder. Okay, there we go. Of course, this is another neighborhood that has very few amenities in walking distance. It's beautiful in its own way. What kid doesn't like to light off firecrackers in the hydro corridor and play tag? But it's really not good if you got kids and you just got to get some fresh, healthy food on the table in winter. There's a wide variety of safety concerns in these environments, missing connections, parking lots with lots of distracted drivers, poor and obstructed sight lines, perceived risks and fear of being trapped. I mean, this is sort of a sad story because, you know, they actually put a pedestrian bridge over a little creek here up in Chalk Farm, but people were terrified to use it because they felt they couldn't escape. Like, you know, as designers, and that's what you're doing, you will think of these things. So it's not just enough to put the bridge in, you have to think about how are people going to perceive it and use it? Okay, we're rounding up to number 6 here. This is a very sad part of the story. People in many of these neighborhoods have tried to make improvements with limited success or none at all. But, you know, it's kind of cool. Like, people are taking it in their own hands and just, like, I love the exit and, like, this informal infrastructure impulse people have. Like, it's fantastic on the one hand, but good God, that really would not cost a lot of money to formalize and to put a ramp and to make it accessible. But there's very few incentives for people to do that because, you know, they don't get a lot of support from the local residents, the businesses, the city staff, the local councilors. You know, this isn't taken to be a very interesting or sexy or important thing by most people in the municipal apparatus. So, but as we know, poor walking conditions contribute to destabilizing communities, poor health, disconnection, and, you know, general malaise. In fact, what we found was that the worse that the maintenance was in areas, the less likely it was to be repaired, and importantly, people perceived that their walking environment had reached the point of no return. Like there's just a place where it gets so bad, no one cares, no one's going to fix it, and that is very sad for a neighborhood. This is a Scarborough Village. People have tried very hard to make some improvements, but still they speak of being very demotivated and depressed by the visuals of these things. So, for instance, this quote here, when it's all ugly around you and nowhere nice to walk, it makes you feel bad and unappreciated. We live here and want to make it beautiful. We heard this over and over again. A good, decent, clean, walkable environment made people feel good about their neighborhood, good about themselves. They felt sad when they came home. They just walked through a nice part of the neighborhood, and then they see the garbage blowing around, the pooling water, and the bad connectivity and the gates. It makes them feel pretty crappy. Still, this is a tribute to the human spirit. They feel great about walking in spite of all these shortcomings in the neighborhood, in the environment. And while they face these unprecedented hardships and discrimination and unequal access to the perks of living in an affluent modern city, they still really love where they live. And they do get out and connect and use the environment. They make do with what is there. And, but they really do deserve better. And they, you know, need some support in making it better. Which we will get to at the end of our lecture to talk about how the improvements in the planning process and consultation may, in fact, be possible. So remember, the point that we want to really impress upon people is that, well, the suburbs are perceived as being a place where there are no walkers, that it's Carville. There, in fact, are many, many walkers of all ages and stripes. And they do like to walk, and they should have better infrastructure. I think I'll leave it at that. Oh, there's the informal infrastructure, another great, the ingenuity of people making connections where they're missing. With that shipping pallet on the left there, this is, it was another person we worked with, Ian Malchevsky, witnessed a woman, there's a church on the other side, and some women from one of the townhouse developments, they would use this on Sundays to get over the train tracks to go to church because it's quite a ways around to walk, and she had her heels in her hand and like her walking boots, and she'd go up the pallet and down the other side. And so like, it's remarkable what people do. But talk about taking risks, it's crazy. It just really shouldn't be this hard to get from A to B. I think that's it. You're up. You're up.
So we saw the conditions, and for sure, it's not going to be easy to transform these places. To understand them, and while we're not going to make them look like Paris or Copenhagen or Amsterdam, it's important to understand how they were structured by post-war planning and design ideas, and how that, in particular, structured kind of property patterns. In older cities, and again, this is like, these pictures are from the area where I live in. The pre-automobile block and lot pattern and kind of incremental development creates a basic framework where streets functioned as both transportation and social spaces. And now we're going back and modifying the streets in these kinds of places to make them more walkable, to kind of control and calm traffic. And once you do that, you actually get a pretty good urban place that supports multiple transportation modes. So, planning is beginning to transform these kinds of places, but they were actually built before planning was a kind of formal municipal activity. Planning in Ontario really only gets going in the post-war period. The Planning Act's in 1946. Metro Toronto, which is one of the first big institutions to kind of implement these planning ideas, is in 53. And municipalities really start planning in the 50s. So it's that regime that we really need to understand the suburban places that we were looking at. And in particular, how public space is structured in the suburbs. So let's go way back and begin with 19th century surveys. There are different survey systems that were used in Ontario. The upper left photograph there shows different surveys around the kind of west end of Lake Ontario. The slide on the bottom left is actually a survey instrument that was used called Gunther's chain. They actually like cut through the forest and they used this chain. What I call it is the most powerful weapon of colonialism ever invented, the survey chain. And the 19th century imposition of the survey grid using those chains was really the technical device for securing a new property regime. The survey grid facilitated turning crown possessions into privately held, non-native property, but also created the road right-of-ways. And this process was key because those right-of-ways became by default the domain that we used to fight for public space and space for pedestrians. So again, different survey systems were used, but it was a 1,000-acre sectional system that was common around Toronto. There we go. That's one on the upper right there. So those surveys were 1,000 chains on the side. They created 100-acre farm lots, and those a rural road had to be developed basically along the survey lines that was one chain wide. So basically 2% of the total land area was set aside for public use as part of the survey system. And that's really the significant part. That's the part that in the suburban context we really fight over. For many of the townships surrounding Toronto, this pattern of large blocks of privatized land surrounded by narrow public right-of-ways remained largely intact until suburbanization occurred in the post-World War II period. And that's when those new planning laws and institutions were created that actually created probably the strongest planning regime at the time in North America in terms of implementing a fully modernist idea of how we should make cities. I think actually the Toronto suburbs are probably the most fully realized model of modern development in North America in many ways. So on the upper left there, you can just kind of see the survey grid in the countryside, and this is just actually a contemporary map showing roads. Outside of the kind of stuff that's developed as urban land, you can still see the survey grid. And within the urbanized area, all the development kind of takes place within that grid. So I think people go to architecture school know part of this story, at least. They learn as part of their architectural history and how the region developed. Central to the post-war planning ideas was the creation of the neighborhood unit with family housing protected from traffic surrounding community facilities such as parks and schools. These images are part of the early Scarborough plan, which was really a fully articulated, very technocratic vision of that. The left slide there, you can kind of see the survey grid, which was a little bit different in Scarborough because it's an older grid. And then inside the grid, these little squares actually each designated what was supposed to be inside one of those concession blocks. How much land for housing, how much land for park, how much land for schools, and I think they also had land for church sites. So that's very clear here. The upper left side there is Clarence Perry's idea of the neighborhood unit, so that became the model. The center slide is actually Don Mills' development, which fully articulated that. And the right slide and the bottom slide are areas of development in Toronto. This is Scarborough, actually. You can see the schools and parks in the center of all this housing. And the same thing there. The arterial streets kind of create this grid, and the neighborhood is turned to the inside. So a lot of the planning and geography literature talks about how the suburbs don't have public space. And it usually looks at malls as sort of privatized spaces. But actually, the neighborhood unit did very much create public space. It created local streets that were supposed to calm traffic, control traffic, prevent cars from driving through. It created parks and schools. And it was actually partly around the idea of kids walking to school. So in some ways, the suburbs were intentionally created as pedestrian spaces. They were about pedestrians, about children walking in some respects. So that's inside the concession blocks. Now let's turn to those right-of-ways that were created by the survey grid. The concession roads is what were refashioned as suburban arterials in the post-war period, firmly in the domain of traffic engineers. And the purpose for the arterial is very clear. As the Toronto Road Classification System states, arterials are, quote, intended to serve primarily a traffic movement function. So you see that in this diagram. This is the Toronto arterial system. That's the idea of a hierarchical system, which trades off mobility for property access. So the little streets inside, which are the neighborhood unit streets, those are for getting to your property, not for really for moving cars. And as you go up the system to expressways, that's not for any access at all. There's very limited access highways. That's for moving cars. And the arterials are very much on that side of the hierarchy. They're about mobility, and they actually, this is the kind of idealized version of them that was created in many places in Toronto. They're for moving cars. They're not about property access. The problem is they often become the suburban main streets where people have to go and shop, which they were never conceptualized to play that role. So that's that same area of Scarborough I just showed on the previous map. Those are the arterials, the neighborhood units inside the arterials. What I want to talk about next, which is really where all the apartments and the pedestrians are we were talking about, are those in-between zones there. So they're not really articulated very well in this kind of post-war planning vision, but they're areas of large property that are kind of squeezed between the neighborhood unit that has a social function and public space, and the arterial, which is for moving traffic. So I'm going to just give a couple of examples of how that translates into the kind of conditions that Jane was describing. This is a photo of Don Valley Village, which is better known as the Peanut because of the shape of this road here in that big peanut shape. This is Don Mills, which is an arterial street. And in the middle of it, there are a bunch of higher order community spaces. The high school is there. Shopping is just over here on the arterial. There's another little shopping center up there. On this side, you can see the neighborhood unit very clearly articulated. With the school and the parks, they have a nice connected system of walkways between the parks that people can walk in. But it's these zones here, the apartments, that I want to talk about on these big kinds of property. And it's those people that really don't have public space in the suburbs. And it's those people that are basically forced to walk in conditions which are not actually being provided for by the public like they are in the old city. In the old city, it's the streets. But in these places, a lot of it's on those big, large private lots. So this comes from some of the maps that we created as part of our workshops. We worked with the people in these apartment buildings. I know this is a little bit difficult to read, but the red lines are compiled from the routes that they showed that they took to walk. So some people go down in the streets and they go various places. But a lot of these people actually cut through these properties in various ways across private property. And those are so that's a fence that's been cut off as part of that route. That's a kind of muddy path up a hill up through a fence that people get through right here. There used to be a path, but now they use that fence. And we have a nice quote that shows that. So again, generally, people expressed a high degree of satisfaction with the overall design of this community. As one resident noted, I like my neighborhood as I'm close to the mall, library, parks, and groceries and community center. But walking to those kinds of places is highly problematic because of the private property conditions. So those walkways, again, were often closed by the owners. As one resident explained, in '69 there was a path, and they put in a fence, and I was bloody mad. I had to walk all the way up to Goodview to take my kids to the pool. And then they built a path, and we used to scramble up that path. Well, they didn't build a path. She's talking about actually this muddy path that goes up through the fence pole. So we asked, some residents were definitely uncomfortable with kind of using some of those kinds of paths, but when we asked them who uses the route, some of the focus group presidents were clear and said things like, well, we all do, of course, which makes sense. I mean, they actually are acting highly rationally. So this is another study area. This area was not master planned like the Peanut was that I showed on the last slide, but rather consists of a series of apartment towers strung along a 6-lane arterial interspersed with strip malls and a shopping plaza. And again, you see the neighborhood unit at work here. So the apartments are here, but behind it is the school and the fence and the single-family housing. The apartments are actually fenced off from that school site. That picture of we'll see it again, the picture of the slide that says exit with a sign through the fence is actually behind those apartments into that school site. This diagram shows some of the shortcuts that people use. The one at the top they call the ghost house shortcut. While the neighborhoods were originally designed so that kids would live in the family housing and be able to walk to the school, actually a lot of the kids are now in the apartment towers, and some of them use that ghost house shortcut. They call that because it's through a property that has an abandoned house on it. If they don't use that, they have to kind of walk all the way around to the school. And then there's some other shortcuts, like people filter through the strip malls here to go down to the shopping center. So again, this is one of those diagrams that show where people walk. So we did our workshops with the people that live in this cluster. You can see the line through the shortcut to the school. All these lines that filter through the back of the strip malls. A lot of the pictures Jane showed with all the mud and everything was kind of in back here, and people have several routes that they go through here. The other route to school is through this kind of driveway, which is again a private facility. There was no lighting at night there. It was full of potholes. People said things in the workshops like, oh, if we could just have lighting like over there. Well, the lighting over there was on the public street. Because this wasn't public, it didn't have the lighting. So one of the main points here about this whole slide is that most of these routes are actually not on public space at all, but they're on these big private pieces of property, and that's where the walking conditions are really bad and very difficult to change because they're within private ownership. So just some slides. That's the informal infrastructure Jane showed. That's part of the ghost house shortcut, which these other images are from. And those are just some images of how people get to the shopping center. So they kind of filter through the back of the strip malls, and then they cross the arterial street where there isn't a formal crossing. So going back to the beginning a little bit, there have been many planning and design ideas of how to improve walkability. There's a diagram by Chris Hardwick, an architect in Toronto, about what constitutes a complete street that accommodates bikes and pedestrians and so forth. The diagram on the bottom there on the left is about retrofitting suburban shopping malls and making them into more urban conditions. And then Toronto's avenues kind of policy, which used to produce images like this showing how we were going to turn these suburban arterials into Parisian avenues, is another attempt. The Tower Renewal Initiative in Toronto that's been championed by people like Graham Stewart and ERA Architects looks more carefully at the situation of the inner suburbs of Toronto, but they often even there use the precedents of tower renewal in European context, where towers tend to be either social housings, often for the middle class, but still social housing, or controlled by big housing cooperatives that can kind of work together and transform the property. What we have is a kind of European model in an American property context, and that's actually what makes it so difficult. So what these strategies are going up against is the reality, again, of property in these places, that most pedestrians are relying on routes that are in fact not public, and which cities cannot invest in. Cities are not allowed to invest in private land. They must instead work with property owners to encourage improvements. So Jane, why don't you wrap it up?
This is a group that we worked with in Scarborough Village that attempted to make an improvement and just to clean it up, basically. But, you know, it just became, okay, so something happened. People came together, which was amazing, and they got a little bit of an improvement. You know, the path was widened a little bit, but no curves were removed or anything like that. But also, sadly, the discourse around which this could be achieved was the police. I know I don't have the Marxist theory close at hand but this is like the justification for making a walkability improvement brought it back to like safety and dangerous neighborhoods and youth, and you know, this discourse that's actually really inappropriate and not actually very helpful at all. It just creates further division, further anxiety, further fear. I mean, hey, the kids were pretty thrilled about the horse showing up. Let me be honest. They thought it was very cool. But if that's what one has to, you know, that's what the best the city can do in terms of bringing change, is kind of bringing police in, using it as a community policing event and get to know the police a bit. And maybe then what they did was they cut down this tree. That was the walkability improvement. So it's not really a wholesome, broad, big idea kind of approach. So in order to make changes, one has to engage with the community, but I would say that this is not a very good example of that. But, you know, they were happy to at least have accomplished something. Don't want to be overly negative. The next slide. This is another group of women I worked with in Dorset Park who are pretty amazing, that got eventually an improvement in this walkway. This is where their kids went to school every day. They just wanted the fence to be knocked down so that they didn't feel as trapped and unsafe in it, among other things. But this is the work that I do now, which is engaging people in neighborhoods around revitalization and changes. And what I've learned out of that is that you have to really welcome people in. You have to speak their language. You have to be clear to people, realistic about what's on the table for influence. You can't just say you know design the environment, there's no end of the money, but people will respond well to an honest, transparent process where realistic goals are set and real dialogue occurs, transparency, good solid information, good reporting. And also I believe that people aren't in the consultative process necessarily looking for consensus. I think consensus is overrated, and it's actually paralyzing to communities. Not all people will agree all the time. If that's what you need to move forward, you're not going to really move forward. So that might be a little bit extreme sounding on the one hand, but I think if you provide great information, most people will actually tend to conclude in the same general area about what's possible, what's desirable, and change will happen. And confidence is built, trust in a process, perhaps even a modest uptick in the quality of the democracy. Call me crazy. But yeah, it can happen. It just can be done.